too many financial and academic policies undertaken at colleges and universities in the UK are counterproductive. That is, assuming their ultimate aim is to generate the best possible grades and outcomes for their students, while maintaining the high standards of an educational institution, which it should be. However, while certain decisions appear strange, the motivation behind them becomes more transparent when we consider the Latin phrase, cui bono? Who benefits? And in the current higher education system, those who undoubtedly reap the greatest rewards from the illogical policies are those who implemented them. Administrators, professors, and trustees can implement their own preferences virtually unchallenged. Boards of studies have delegated authority from the University Senate for the maintenance of academic standards and quality within their academic subject area. Essentially, the government grants the institution funds to spend as it pleases, such is the non-profit status. So if the only people you have to answer to is a group to which you are a member, such as the college board and fellow members of staff, rather than the demands of investors who care about their return, then the desire to adapt and develop in accordance with the needs and interests of the paying customer is constrained. In the UK, 2/3 of universities now have more administrators than they do faculty staff. According to a study by the London School of Economics, the substantial growth in non-academic staff is partly due to an increasing demand to deal with all aspects of the student experience, for instance welfare workers and career advisors. They're losing sight of the main goal, which is to educate the students while maintaining high academic standards. Conversely, the reason members of a private entity cannot pursue their own interests and self-indulgences is because of the ever-present reality of the consequences. In an enterprise that is profit-seeking opposed to publicly funded, prioritizing self-interest at the expense of the customer will result in extinction. Individual investors and stockholders do not have the same clout as banks do when it comes to holding the company to account. Nor do they stay informed as to the process by which they will generate income to the same extent. Skilled orators in any field can perhaps shield financial anomalies to some investors, but there is no such smokescreen for the balance sheet. Making a profit or loss cannot be concealed. And this is where the higher education system is flawed. When an institution relies on public funding, no such financial bottom line exists. What stake does the government or foundations with equivalent non-profit status have in the success of an institution whose outcomes affect other people? However, when someone bears the consequences of their own decisions, then motivation and decision-making radically change. Satisfying what the professors, team leaders, and administrators deem as appropriate and inclusive content usually involves enforcing the contradictory diversity and equity quotas. Anyone who has worked at or attended a higher educational institution in the UK in the last 10 to 15 years will be aware of the intellectual agenda, such as encouraging activism, decolonization, and resentment towards capitalism. Which is why these anti-imperial protests and self-identifying gender and ethnic expressions typically emerge on college and university campuses. The level of subtlety is institution-dependent. However, these unnatural policies are severely restricted when paying customers are involved. But in the current government intervening setup, the taxpayers are funding something over which they have very little say. Nor are the wishes of donors, dead or alive, typically realized, hence the number of lawsuits and litigation. This occurs when the academic institution pursues its own interest at the expense of the target it was originally designated for. Thus, to avoid such a scenario, there is a universal preference among university administrators for governmental funds over donations, as this automatically frees them of any restraining conditions. Once granted, the extent to which the university research generated from such funding is deemed valuable is debatable. Independent analysis of the typical papers submitted and published regard the majority of this research as simply CV padding and irrelevant, opposed to being of any significant benefit to society. This would not be tolerated if profit-seeking financial institutions were holding those responsible to account. And if finding a job is the responsibility of the graduate, then there is no real deterrent on the number of degrees and PhDs that universities can award. For years, cross-culturally, the concern that the demand in the qualified fields does not meet the oversupplied graduates has not been heeded. In the humanities and social sciences, in particular, there are sometimes hundreds of applicants competing for one job. As a result, every year thousands of students prolong their academic career and reluctantly take up some research post because they can't find a job. Most funding for research in higher education institutions comes from direct funding routes. The House of Lords Science and Technology Committee noted that before COVID, 62% of research in UK higher education institutions was publicly funded. And another 15% of the funding comes from UK charities. Therefore, over 3/4 of university research is from fellow non-profit organisations, not seeking a return on investment. The most common type of PhD salary is a stipend which is usually offered as part of a studentship. Studentships are one of the most attractive sources of PhD funding, which normally cover full tuition fees and living costs. PhD studentships are offered by universities, government bodies, and independent research charities. Students who successfully secure funding are offered a non-repayable tax-free grant to cover living costs such as rent, food, and bills. There is also student finance, graduate teaching assistantships, businesses, and trusts that often fund PhD study. Without this backing, students would have to self-fund the training required when pursuing a doctorate, or acquire a full studentship funded out of the university's own research budget. With such financial constraints, the university reins would be automatically tightened on the careless dispensing of degrees. There would be far less people applying for a PhD if they didn't have a degree to begin with. The real benefit of the free market system is that it forces people to take responsibility and make more shrewd decisions, as it is their own money at stake. Similarly, postdoctorate generosity alleviates the financial onus that would otherwise be placed on the universities to accommodate their unemployed alumni. So despite the lack of demand, graduates continue to refine these alleged skills. And subsidized government funding reduces the desire to award fewer degrees. Unlike the rest of the free enterprise world, supply and demand does not apply in academia. But what if students paid for their own tuition? As it currently stands in the UK, any grants and bursaries given to students don't have to be repaid. And in Scotland, every student is entitled to free tuition. But what are the consequences of this? This student is now statistically more likely to achieve a higher salary throughout his or her working life than someone who may be of equal intelligence, but not academically inclined. So these grants and bursaries so generously donated by the taxpayer cannot be enjoyed by those not going into higher education. Instead, aligned to the concept of responsibility for financial consequences shaping decisions, would it not be more desirable to propose a system whereby everyone can pursue higher education, on the condition that they pay for it themselves? Due to the evident pay disparity in every country, some students or their parents would be able to pay tuition upfront, whereas others would need to consider a loan rather than relying on charitable grants and bursaries. Committing to a loan accomplishes two feats simultaneously. It ensures genuine equality of opportunity with regards to access to higher education, but it also imbues the potential graduate and/or their family with a responsibility to earn enough to repay it. An incentive which would otherwise be missing had their fees, or a large chunk of it, been covered by the government. The motivation to see out the higher education course, and thus make the repayments, is a real one. The Students' Loan Company in England, SLC, states explicitly, students begin to repay any loans when they start earning over a certain amount. By law, you must repay your loan in line with the loan contract and regulations. If you don't make repayments, SLC have the right to take legal action to recover your debt. This means SLC can get a court order to make you repay the total debt plus interest and penalties in a single payment. While the more affluent students have no such consideration, this lack of motivation often turns out to be to their detriment. The distinction that has to be made is between an unfairness that is natural and one that is contrived. Subsidizing students who choose to pursue higher education at the expense of those who do not falls under the latter. The Treasury budget set out in 2021 included payments for employers that hire new apprenticeships, as well as the announcement of a £7 million fund. This was to help employers in England set up and expand portable apprenticeships. However, between May 2010 and January 2021, roughly 11 years, only 4.75 million apprenticeships were created. To provide some context, in the 2018-19 academic year alone, there were an estimated 2.38 million students studying at UK higher education institutions. Clearly, apprenticeships have some way to go before they are considered as desirable as a degree. And even postgraduate funding aside, PhD or not, the 3 to 4 years of undergraduate funding, in the form of non-repayable grants and bursaries, is grossly unfair when the taxpayer doesn't fund apprenticeships to the same degree, literally. By receiving a fraction of the funding afforded to students in higher education, the government is implying that domestic companies and businesses are less valuable to society than a degree, regardless of the field. It seems silly to claim philosophy graduates contribute more to everyday life than those who keep our cars on the road, our plumbing running smoothly, and the electricity working efficiently. By removing government intervention, universities would have to invest their own money wisely to compete against one another in order to attract prospective students. This free market system permits people to not only pay for what they want, but what they deem good value for their own money. Nobel Prize-winning American economist Milton Friedman sums up the inescapable incentive-driven cycle perfectly. People value what they pay for, and will pay for what they value.